The year is 1970. The world is getting smaller, and one solitary corporate empire is responsible for shrinking it. High above the Atlantic Ocean, a Boeing 747, a magnificent gleaming leviathan of the skies, cruises effortlessly at 35,000 feet. Inside, the cabin does not resemble any traditional aircraft. It is a flying palace designed for the global elite. Passengers in tailored suits and elegant designer dresses dine on beluga caviar, freshly carved roast beef and vintage French champagne, all served by flight attendants who are widely viewed not as waitstaff, but as highly trained global ambassadors. On the towering tail of this mechanical marvel is a simple, perfect azure blue globe. This is American World Airways, the undisputed, untouchable sovereign of the skies. It is the physical embodiment of 20th century American luxury, geopolitical power, and limitless technological reach. Now, fast forward to a desolate, sun-baked stretch of the Mojave Desert in the late 1990s. The wind howls through the cracked and hollowed-out fuselage of a massive commercial aircraft. The iconic azure blue globe on its towering tail is blistered by the relentless desert sun, peeling away in dry, brittle flakes of paint. The luxurious upper-deck spiral staircases that once hosted global celebrities, diplomats, and royalty are completely stripped of their plush carpets, revealing nothing but bare, corroded aluminum. The first-class seats are gone, ripped from their tracks. The massive jet engines have been violently torn from the wings, auctioned off for raw scrap value. This is no longer a palace of the skies. It is a rusted, decaying carcass, a metallic ghost rotting away silently in an endless aviation graveyard. How does an untouchable titan, a brand so overwhelmingly powerful that it practically invented global air travel, end up as scrap metal buried in the desert sand? What truly happens when a colossal empire of the skies loses its wings and falls violently back to Earth? To understand the sheer, terrifying magnitude of this corporate collapse, one must first measure the dizzying height from which American World Airways fell. Under the iron-fisted, relentlessly visionary leadership of its founder, Juan Trippe, Pan Am was never merely an airline. It was an instrument of geopolitical force, an unofficial arm of the United States State Department. In the 1930s, Pan Am conquered the unconquerable oceans with its fleet of majestic flying boats, the famous Clippers, establishing the first trans-Pacific and transatlantic passenger routes. It built remote island bases across the Pacific Ocean purely to refuel its planes, effectively taming the globe. When the jet age dawned, Trippe ruthlessly dragged the entire aviation industry into the future, placing a massive order for the Boeing 707 and permanently altering the speed of global commerce. But it was in the late 1960s that Pan Am committed an act of unprecedented corporate hubris that would cement its legend and plant the seeds of its ultimate destruction. Trippe convinced the Boeing company to build the 747 jumbo jet. It was an apocalyptic financial gamble. Pan Am ordered 25 of these massive, untried aircraft before a single prototype had even been fully engineered. Trippe essentially bet the entire net worth of his airline on the absolute belief that the future of international travel belonged to massive, luxurious leviathans moving enormous volumes of passengers. At its absolute zenith in the early 1970s, Pan Am possessed a monopoly on international routes. It owned the most recognizable office building on the Manhattan skyline, a towering monolith bearing its name. It owned the Intercontinental Hotel chain, ensuring its passengers slept in Pan Am-owned beds anywhere in the world. Its terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport, the famed Worldport, was a modernist architectural masterpiece, a sweeping, futuristic concrete umbrella under which the world's elite gathered before conquering the globe. It was the chosen carrier of American presidents, the Beatles, and James Bond. It was a corporate empire that seemed utterly invincible. It was, by all metrics of the era, simply too big to fail. Yet, the foundational pillars of this magnificent empire were built upon a highly unstable economic fault line. Pan Am's greatest perceived strengths, its massive, fuel-thirsty international wide-body fleet, and its absolute reliance on government-protected route monopolies, would slowly transform into the exact instruments of its execution. The first catastrophic, fracture in the foundation occurred in the autumn of 1973. The OPEC oil embargo struck the global economy with the devastating force of an industrial hammer. Almost overnight, the price of aviation fuel skyrocketed to unprecedented levels. Pan Am's magnificent, sprawling fleet of Boeing 747s, once the ultimate symbol of its supremacy and economic power, instantly became a suffocating financial noose. These massive four-engine aircraft required a staggering amount of highly expensive fuel to cross the world's oceans, and suddenly, operating them became prohibitively expensive. Worse still, the ensuing global economic recession meant that drastically fewer people were traveling. The luxurious upper-deck lounges of the 747s, once packed with elites, were now flying empty across the Atlantic. The sheer volume of passengers required to make the jumbo jets profitable evaporated. Pan Am was hemorrhaging cash at an alarming rate, burning through its massive corporate reserves just to keep its enormous planes mechanically airborne. But the fatal blow, the deep, unhealable wound from which the giant would never recover, was entirely self-inflicted, born of desperation and shifting political landscapes. In 1978, the United States government passed the Airline Deregulation Act. The sky, which had been tightly controlled and regulated for decades, was suddenly a vicious, hyper-competitive free market. Domestic American airlines, previously confined to flying solely within the borders of the United States, were suddenly allowed to aggressively expand their routes internationally, initiating brutal, cutthroat price wars. Pan Am, historically barred from operating domestic routes by the government to protect its prestigious international monopoly, suddenly found itself stranded on an island. It had absolutely no domestic feeder network to supply its international flights. A passenger flying from Kansas City to Paris could no longer rely on Pan Am for the entire journey. Aggressive domestic competitors were now scooping up these localized passengers and flying them internationally on their own rapidly expanding fleets. In a blind, panicked move to acquire a domestic network and save its passenger feed, Pan Am made one of the most disastrous corporate blunders in aviation history. In 1980, it purchased National Airlines, a Florida-based domestic carrier, for a vastly inflated price of $437 million. It was a catastrophic corporate mismatch of monumental proportions. The corporate cultures of the prestigious, globally minded Pan Am and the localized, informal National Airlines were violently incompatible. The union seniority lists clashed immediately, leading to bitter, protracted internal warfare and devastating strikes. The fleet types were entirely different, doubling the airline's maintenance, training, and operational costs overnight. Instead of serving as a financial lifeboat for Pan Am, the chaotic acquisition of National Airlines acted as a massive iron anchor, dragging the already drowning corporate giant further into the abyss. By the mid-1980s, the melancholic, deeply humiliating dismantling of the empire had officially begun. To merely survive another fiscal quarter, Pan Am was forced to consume its own limbs. The physical liquidation of a titan is a brutal, unforgiving process. First went the undisputed crown jewel of its real estate empire, the iconic Pan Am building in Midtown Manhattan. The massive, glowing blue globe was unceremoniously ripped from the New York City skyline, eventually replaced by the sterile logo of the MetLife Insurance Company. The physical erasure of the brand's dominance had commenced. Next came the painful geographic retreat. Desperate for cash, Pan Am was forced to sell its entire Pacific route network, the very routes it had spent 50 years pioneering, dominating, and defending, to its fierce rival, United Airlines. The colossal 747s that once proudly carried the historic Clipper names across the vast Pacific Ocean were suddenly stripped of their Pan Am livery, hastily repainted in United colors, and flown by United crews. Pan Am was rapidly shrinking. The once global empire was now a bruised, localized, and financially battered carrier, desperately clinging to its remaining European and Latin American roots just to delay the inevitable. Then came the dark, freezing night of December 21, 1988. The terrorist bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, was a devastating, heartbreaking human catastrophe that claimed 270 lives. But from a coldly analytical, purely corporate standpoint, the bombing was the absolute final nail in the airline's coffin. The tragic event completely shattered global consumer confidence. In an era before the implementation of advanced digital security protocols, the public perception solidified around a terrifying reality. Pan Am, as the most recognizable historic symbol of American influence abroad, was a flying target. Passengers abandoned the airline in massive droves, terrified to board planes bearing the blue globe. Corporate revenues plummeted overnight. The corporate entity, already bleeding profusely from 1,000 economic cuts, entered a state of terminal, irreversible failure. The outbreak of the Gulf War in 1990 caused another massive spike in fuel prices, delivering the final crushing blow. In January 1991, the once mighty Pan-American World Airways officially declared bankruptcy. It limped along for 11 agonizing months, a hollowed-out, pathetic zombie corporation, desperately seeking a financial savior that would never arrive. On December 4, 1991, the giant finally collapsed under its own massive weight. In a stark, cold bankruptcy courtroom, the final decision was handed down. There would be no rescue, no further cash injections. The airline was ordered to immediately and permanently cease all flight operations. The physical aftermath of this sudden, violent death was instantaneous, chaotic, and deeply melancholic. Thousands of dedicated Pan Am employees, many of whom had given their entire adult lives to the prestige of the blue globe, arrived at airports around the world for their shifts, only to find the ticket counters padlocked and the departure screens permanently dark. Massive, multi-million-dollar aircraft were suddenly grounded exactly where they sat on the tarmac. In London, Paris, Frankfurt, and Miami, fully fueled Boeing 747s were ordered by air traffic control to shut down their engines mid-taxi. Passengers were stranded globally. The sky was abruptly emptied of its most famous, historic resident. The massive corporate carcass was then violently torn apart by relentless creditors. Delta Airlines purchased the remaining profitable European routes and the Pan Am shuttle operations on the East Coast. The iconic Worldport terminal at JFK, once the glittering, glamorous gateway to the world, was unceremoniously taken over by Delta. But what happened to the physical assets? Where did the massive, tangible machinery of this global empire go? The fleet was scattered to the winds. The newer, more fuel-efficient aircraft were quickly leased out to other global airlines, permanently losing their Pan Am identity. But the older Boeing 747s, the very pioneering airframes that had forcefully ushered in the golden age of mass travel, were deemed far too inefficient and mechanically tired for the modern aviation market. They were fueled and flown one last tragic time. Not to glamorous international capitals, but to the arid, silent, sprawling boneyards of the American Southwest. Here, under the blistering desert sun, the industrial butchery took place. Teams of specialized scrappers descended upon the grounded giants. The luxurious custom-designed interiors were violently ripped out and tossed into massive industrial dumpsters. The massive Pratt & Whitney jet engines were surgically removed and sold off piecemeal for replacement parts. The gleaming aluminum fuselages, which had safely carried millions of people across turbulent oceans, were ruthlessly sliced apart by giant hydraulic industrial shears. The metal was melted down into raw ingots, entirely erasing the physical history of the machines. The physical spaces Pan Am left behind suffered an equally depressing, melancholic fate. The magnificent Worldport terminal at JFK, a building that truly belonged to a hopeful jet-age future that never fully materialized, slowly decayed. It became painfully obsolete, its sweeping, iconic concrete roof unable to accommodate the stringent demands of 21st-century airport security and expanded aircraft wingspans. For years, it sat in a state of depressing, visible neglect. Its once white concrete was stained with jet exhaust. Its massive windows were clouded with grime. Finally, in 2013, the heavy demolition crews arrived. The massive, flying saucer roof was methodically torn apart by heavy excavators. The physical footprint of Pan Am's greatest architectural achievement was completely wiped from the earth, eventually replaced by a generic, flat expanse of concrete tarmac used merely for parking Delta jets. Even the intellectual property, the legendary name, the perfect blue globe logo, the very soul of the brand, was subjected to a deeply degrading, humiliating afterlife. The Pan Am name was auctioned off in bankruptcy court, purchased by various opportunistic investors who attempted to resurrect the airline on the cheap. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, minor underfunded regional carriers briefly flew outdated. Second-hand planes bearing the proud Pan Am logo, flying obscure, low-yield domestic routes to secondary cities. It was a pathetic, almost insulting mimicry of the original global giant. Today, the once untouchable Pan Am brand is heavily licensed out to sell cheap, artificial nostalgia. You can easily buy the iconic blue globe printed on cheap plastic tote bags, generic coffee mugs, and fast-fashion t-shirts in airport gift shops around the world. The absolute majesty of a global, world-changing empire has been tragically reduced to a trademarked, mass-produced novelty item. The staggering fall of American World Airways stands as a harsh, unforgiving lesson in the brutal reality of corporate mortality. It proves that no matter the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the giant, no matter how deeply it is woven into the cultural, political, and historical fabric of a century, it is never immune to the cold laws of economics and the relentless passage of time. The massive globe-spanning fleets of jetliners, the sprawling architectural marvels of its terminals, the tens of thousands of dedicated professionals in their pristine uniforms. All of it can evaporate into the ether of history. What remains today is only the quiet aftermath. A few faded archival photographs, a rusting, unrecognizable piece of aluminum half buried in a desert boneyard, and the deeply melancholic memory of a golden era when a single, perfect blue globe commanded the vastness of the skies, long before the crushing weight of its own magnificent empire dragged it down to the scrap heap of history.